go maigúibh agus tapalaibh son an choram lawarst an dú an cúspar seo. Ha mi bhí smúneach an cúspar haar iomach bliana ach seo hiad turas a churmí mo bheachgan amach sé cúspar caran durbh a ham agus ha mi dóchas gompi so mór agus an seminar seo áte ma agus freicarach son an jesped. Ha mi dul a háiseach le pís bardach an Gàidhlig ach an uair sin bí mi glúsaid go bearla le ma leiscealan. Nis ha mi do dhéanamh screen share. A bhí sin a gopar. Roag an sa bhliana dá bhíle. Nuair a bheith an neannach an súl as a chúra mo dhéirigh, bí mi rídíideach duineagan. Bí iad an sin a clúich chartin sa gol bóisiúlaí púdal a downstum an casan. Bí áileach blá a bhaine fallamh as na báchanan, is iad lán hrúintir an fuar cruai potterí son an luch tuiris. Buam nan brach an taketeach nan saolichan a cosisiach monag na crochtin uaine fásal gun bhrísteach spatje. Nuair a bheith an neannach an súl as a chúra mo dhéirigh, bí mi rí farchlúis duineagan. Rít osagan a gáchanich sna gúhan cruai sasanach a dul an ui na gui. Roag 2000 AD appeared in a number of anthologies before publication in Ré na Haiche, Katrina Montgomery's first single-authored collection published by Canongate in 1994. She'd previously published A Chuile Hir, a jointly authored volume with her sister Morag in the 1970s. Ré na Haiche was introduced by Sorley Maclean, who said of Montgomery that there is much poignancy as well as humour in her poetry. Her poetry is very serious, with not a trace of show-off, and contains a superficial simplicity which belies a psychological complication. She's a poet of integrity with the taste of truth on her language. And on Roag itself, he said that the poem has a muted sorrow and anger and a muted humour as well. The following year, the poem was also commented upon by James Hunter in On the Other Side of Sorrow, an acclaimed book republished in 2014 that's become a key text in relation to environmentalism and land reform in the Gàidhealtachd. Hunter gave an English translation of Roag 2000 AD and then made a series of assertions about the views he felt the poem promoted on native incomer dynamics. And he used these assertions as a springboard for his own influential views on how to incorporate cultural diversity in the area. I'll go into that in more detail now. While admitting that a small corner of any Highlander's mind is likely to have some sympathy with the sentiments he'd read in the poem, Hunter categorically condemned them. He said that such sentiments deserve in the end to be rejected as reactionary, exclusivist, and inadmissibly pessimistic. This condemnation rested on Hunter's delineation of the following sentiments that he had found in the poem. The poem was, Montgomery was exclusivist because she appears to believe that Gaelic culture cannot belong to anyone but those who are by descent and upbringing Gaels. The poem's reactionary because it explicitly associates Gaelic culture with milk in the byre and other symbols of a past now every bit as irretrievable as the world of Columcille. And she's inadmissibly pessimistic because the poem assumes that neither Gael nor incomer are interested in or capable of reaching out to one another. This is a straightforward rejection or dismissal of the poem and the poet based on the assumption that she's writing about a division between Gael and incomers and from a position of excluding or rejecting the incomer. And it's important to note that in the way it was written in Hunter's book, this is an assumption. He gave no evidence to support his view that native incomer relations is in fact the poem's theme. I want to offer an alternative reading of Roag 2000 AD, which questions the basis of Hunter's assertions. I'll argue that it's by no means certain that the sentiments Hunter believed he'd found in the poem are actually there. There is in fact a way of reading the poem in which the relationship that Hunter believed he'd found in it between Gael and incomers does not exist. On this reading, his categorical condemnation of what he believed to be the poem's sentiments is meaningless. Moreover, I'll argue that this alternative reading is better evidence than the one Hunter believed to be true. This interpretation of Roag 2000 AD contends that the complaint that the poet is actually making is concerned with the existential suffering and loneliness caused when an indigenous people become culturally and linguistically deracinated intergenerationally. I'm then going to broaden my analysis to look at how Hunter's critique of Montgomery discloses the way that he articulates and positions what it seems to me are two distinct identities in his work, namely Gael and Highlander. I'll then offer some thoughts or comments on the effect of this positioning for Gael in the Gàidhealtachd today. And this is stuff that I'm much less clear on and still feeling my way into, and really just seeking to contribute to the debate on Gael as a long-standing ethno-linguistic minority in Scotland, a debate which has been refreshed or rekindled by the Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community Report from Sailship, and by other contributions, including from academics from the Scipa Misneach, and most recently by Patrick Morrison's grounded but forward-looking Iain MacKinnon lecture to Uncommon Gaelach, and also contributions to a forthcoming special edition of Scottish Affairs, which is focused on Gàidhealtachd futures. I need to say that I'm approaching Montgomery's poem and Hunter's criticism of it, not as a Gaelic scholar or as a literary scholar, but as a Gael with an interest in the relationships between people and place in the Gàidhealtachd and our people's creativity. So my reading of this situation is an attempt to understand why, despite appreciating much of the discussion and argument on the other side of sorrow, and I want to emphasize that here, although I'm not dealing with it today, it's an outstanding book in many ways. I'm also dissatisfied with aspects of it, and in particular the treatment of Montgomery's poetry. I've been helped in my thinking by discussions with many people, including I can see some who are present today. Because of my lack of expertise, I'm trying to be tentative in my approach. However, I can't make my case without being assertive, as this alternative reading obviously involves contesting the meaning that James Hunter has attributed to Roag 2000 AD, and I want to say a little bit methodologically now about how I'm going to go about contesting that meaning. There's no room for caveat or ambiguity in Hunter's analysis of Roag 2000 AD, so much so that it doesn't come across as an interpretation at all, or even as an explanation of what the poem means, but is simply presented as a series of critical assertions about the poem's views, as if the meaning of the poem itself were self-evident. I would say from the fairly unequivocal rejection Hunter made of Roag 2000 AD that he's approached Montgomery's work in the way a historian might, trying to establish a firm and fixed meaning for the text in order to place the poem in a wider, meaningful historical narrative trajectory. And trying to understand why poiesis, that is, creativity that's brought forth and born from poetic modes of attention, requires a different kind of analysis from the typical texts of the historical record, we can make use of a distinction drawn by the German hermeneutic philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer between what he called the poetic word and the intentional word. Gadamer believed that the intentional word can be explained conceptually without interpretation or scrutiny. The typical text of the historical record may be thought of as constituted of intentional words. For Gadamer, interpretation only becomes crucial when a text holds a multiplicity of meanings. We only have to interpret something when its meaning is not clearly laid down or when it's ambiguous. And ambiguity is the condition of an utterance having more than one meaning, thus causing uncertainty. Such uncertainty is anathema to narrative building in the historical mode of attention. However, as Gadamer notes, poetry as a form of art is saturated with ambiguity. An argument as to why poetic texts demand a different mode of attention was elaborated by Professor James Thorne, who held the Forbes Chair in English Language at Edinburgh University. We read poems, or should, in a way which is quite different from the way in which we read other texts. because in the case of other texts, it's the imposition of one and only one meaning that's important. Learning to read a poem is a matter of learning to hear what we normally must be deaf to, the inexhaustible ambiguity of utterances. And Gadamer observes that all interpretation points in a direction rather than to some final endpoint, in the sense that it points towards an open realm that can be filled in a variety of ways. It's for this reason that I titled the presentation with Runrig's lyrical observation on the words of Sorry Maclean, who, as we know, was a big influence on both Hunter and Montgomery. Runrig described Maclean's words as being around us like spirits released, acting as a creative impetus for the imaginations of young Gaels, an opening realm. Hunter's analysis of, or rather his assertions about, the sentiments he found expressed in Roag 2000 AD mark, so far as he's concerned anyway, a final endpoint, rather than pointing towards an open or opening realm. His assertion on the sentiments that he found there do not allow ambiguity to exist. They're presented as settled and undebatable. He's in no doubt that the sentiments that he found in the poem are those that the poet was trying to share with him. What I'm contending is that for a literary analysis, Hunter's approach is methodologically weak, and I'll argue now that his assertions about the poem Roag 2000 AD reflect that. So as I said, there's no evidence presented, but I think it can be inferred that a key term that led Hunter to assume that Roag 2000 AD is about division between Gael and incomers is the word they, which is in line 3 of the English translation that should be on the screen at the moment, of the poem that appears On the Other Side of Sorrow. It's the only word in the translation there that's been italicized for emphasis. However, before asking who the italicized they are in this line, I think it's important to ask why they is italicized in the first place. Hunter does not explain this. His endnotes show that he's taken the translation of the poem from a collection called Sru na Múile. In neither the English or Gaelic versions of the poem in Sru na Múile are the words it or they italicized. They're not italicized in the collection Ré na Haiche either. Hunter's unacknowledged modification of the poem therefore gives the word they a special significance, which he appears to then use to support his condemnation of the poem's sentiments and to support his later pronouncements on native incomer dynamics, which the critique of the poem was used to justify. However, this emphasis was not intended by Katrina Montgomery, and Hunter's decision to alter the poem in this way means, firstly, that the special significance attached to they belongs to Hunter and not to the poet, and second, that this change in the poem's meaning has not been made available to readers of On the Other Side of Sorrow. As Hunter believes that Montgomery's poem reflects tension between Gael and incomer, and as Montgomery is a Gael, it can also be inferred that Hunter assumes that by they, the poet must be referring to the incomers. Because his assertions exclude the possibility that any meaning other than incomers can be attached to the word they, it seems that Hunter's opinions about the topic of the poem are based on an assumption that he simply knows the reference and therefore the meaning of the word they, rather than on any conscious acknowledgement by him of the inherent ambiguity of the word they, and a subsequent active interpretation by him of to whom they refers in this case. However, despite this assumption, the word they remains ambiguous. And although Hunter has not explained why he assumes the poem is about a native and incomer divide, it seems reasonable to suppose that he's done so on the basis of the translated phrase, harsh English voices clashing with the wind. The poem contains no other ethnic terms of identity. However, the literal translation English, by which Hunter appears to assume the poem is positing this divide, is also ambiguous. It's English voices the poem is describing, but not necessarily the voices of English people. Although it's possible that the poem's narrator was hearing the voices of incomers speaking English, or even of English incomers, other possible meanings exist for them, the poem's archetypal other. It's possible the poet may simply have been hearing other voices that are speaking English. Regardless, Hunter has not accounted for the assertion that the English voices belong to incomers in the translation of the poem that was published in On the Other Side of Sorrow. The Gaelic original of the poem has Naguhan Cruai Sasanach. Although Hunter has not done so in pursuit of his assertions, The use of Sassenach in the Gaelic original could be used to interpret the harsh voices in the concluding line of Montgomery's poem as belonging to English incomers, for Snaguhan Crue Sassenach is literally the hard voice of the Englishman. However, consider this use of the word Sassenach from a late 19th century poem by Gàidhlig Maclean, warning about the impending loss of Gaelic as a result of the 1872 Education Act. Ben cruachan hain as gurme snoog, vi crí fo chra vi turjug truag, a huns nach cloini hui gupuan, ach gullum cruag nan Sassenach. Even Ben Cruachan of greenest hue, and this is a translation by Michael Newton, has a broken heart and grieves mournfully, since it will never hear anything but the harsh chatter of English. I think it's pretty clear that rather than referring to English people or to non-Gael, the word Sassenach here is being used to describe the English language as it will be spoken by Gael who have lost their own tongue. Indeed, the striking similarity between Snaguhan Crue Sassenach in Montgomery's poem and Achgullum Cruag nan Sassenach in the late 19th century text suggests that Katrina Montgomery, a graduate of Celtic at Glasgow University and very well versed in the poetic traditions of her people, might even have been drawing on the creative wellsprings of her bardic ancestor to accentuate her complaint, a tradition which is well attested in Gaelic poetry. In her own English translation of Roag 2000 AD, Montgomery could have chosen a form of words that would have made it clear that she meant the voices of the people she was hearing in Roag 2000 AD were those of incomers and not Gael. She did not do so, and perhaps she chose not to do so. There is then clearly a range of meanings possible in her ambiguous, perhaps deliberately ambiguous, form of words to describe the voices that they speak with. Moreover, if we examine Montgomery's wider body of work, we can see that she's raised the issue of the loss of language and cultural norms within the community of Gael and related feelings of desperation elsewhere in her poetry. This is from Antai Bake, another poem published in the collection Rein na Haike in 1994, the year before On the Other Side of Sorrow was published, when she wrote of contemporary Roag, but the few children who live there speak English only, they whose great-great-grandfathers spoke hardly a word of it. Are we clinging by our nails to the rocks of time at this very moment? This is a later, slightly different translation, which makes the linguistic point more clearly for non-Gaelic speakers. The point is that the voices of these English speakers in Roag are definitely not the voices of people from England. Incidentally, this poem also highlights that it's misguided to assume that Montgomery sees cultural innovations, such as pottery, wine, or poodles, as being something that she and her culture are or ought to be permanently sealed off from. Her later English translation of Taibake begins, "Here as we always were, a wee house on the rocks, although smart plastic pans have replaced clay jars and shells." Nus Patrick Keimpel's Lietrichen deals with similar themes. In the census statistics, the township of Roag is combined with that of neighbouring Orbost, and at the beginning of the 20th century, more than 25% of the population of those two places were unable to comprehend the English language. 90% of the population spoke Gaelic. This was a period of comparative linguistic strength, but linguistically, life in Roag was to change dramatically between 1900 and 2000 AD. In 1981, more than 70% of the population of Roag and Orbost could still speak Gaelic. It was in the following decade that Katrina Montgomery was moved to write her poem. By the end of that decade, the figure for Gaelic speakers had fallen to around 55%. By 2001, less than 45% of those living in the area could speak the language. Yet many of those non-Gaelic speakers belonged to families whose great-great-grandfathers spoke hardly a word of English. As well as placing Roag 2000 AD in the wider context of Montgomery's own, too small in my view, body of work, we can also try to place the poem's striking imagery of the hoodie crow taking the eye out of the last sheep within wider Gaelic literary and metaphorical conventions. In Hunter's unambiguous reading of the poem, we would have to interpret the incomers as the crows picking the eyes out of the sheep who are the Gaels. It's true that in a Gaelic context, the metaphorical use of crows preying on sheep to emphasise unequal or predatory social relationships can be found. Sorley Maclean described the landlords of Skye as hoodie crows in Anculian, and the land and language activist John Murdoch referred to both sheep and crows metaphorically in his evidence to the Napier Commission in the late 19th century. However, there's a much more recent and I think better known metaphorical use of crows and sheep in Gaelic literature, or at least in literature produced by Gael, one that's all the more striking in the context of Montgomery's specific imagery of the hoodie crow taking the eye out of the last sheep. The image recalls Ian Crichton-Smith's extraordinary depiction in Consider the Lilies of the eyeless corpse of a thin Highland sheep passed by the protagonist, Mrs. Scott, on her way to see the minister to appeal to him that she could remain in her home, and of the keen-eyed crow staring at her stonily with fixed eyes as if there was real intelligence behind them, a crow which had already picked the eyes out cleanly from the sheep as if it had been an old brooch. Of course, when Mrs. Scott, who was, as Crichton-Smith makes clear in his introduction, Gaelic speaking, finally meets the minister, he admonishes her community in the name of God and recommends she submit to eviction. And as she listens to him, Mrs. Scott observes, perhaps because of the light eyes which remain cold, although they appear to twinkle, or a trick of the light, or the way his head was cocked, or was it perhaps because of the buzzing of a fly on the window pane? She was reminded of the crow, which had stared untwinklingly at her, only rising at the last moment, as she had left the dead and dreadfully wounded sheep behind. The minister is represented not as the shepherd of his flock, but as one that preys on the helpless dead and dying. And he is a Gaelic speaker going against his own people in the service of an elite landed power to whom his own interests are now attached. A common trope, as many scholars have pointed out, in Gaelic literature and tradition. In the light of such obvious and closely related imagery in Crichton-Smith's very well known and well regarded work, can we really be sure that Montgomery's hoodie crow simply represents an incomer? Although I've offered an interpretation of it here, the meaning of Montgomery's poem remains an open realm. It seems to me that Roag 2000 AD can be read as subtle and ambiguous as poetry can be, and there does indeed, as Sorley Maclean asserted, seem to be a psychological complication in this work that belies superficial assertions about what she's doing. What I've tried to do here is to recover a possible meaning for the poem, and I'm quoting the historian of political thought Quentin Skinner here, by placing the text to be interpreted within a field of assumptions and conventions to which it contributes and from which it derives its distinctly meaningful character. I've sought to establish a meaning for Roag 2000 AD, which can be shown to fit into the broader contexts, both of Montgomery's own other work and also of themes in Gaelic creativity more generally. It seems to me that a more detailed study of the themes in Montgomery's work and a greater knowledge of the conventions and tropes of Gaelic poetry, as well as more reflection on the characteristics of modern poetry in general, would have made James Hunter more cautious and less absolute in his judgments on the meaning of her poem, Roag 2000 AD. I've argued that Montgomery is not simply writing about native incomer dynamics, or at least not writing about them in a sort of simplistic binary sense. Rather, she's writing, as she does elsewhere, of a sense of anguish at the delanguaging and deculturation of her own people. As Montgomery put it herself in 2001, when introducing Roag 2000 AD at a Scottish and Irish writers panel, she described not one group of people being against another, but of Gaelic identity as a secret self in the process of being drowned by other cultural forces. However, and regardless of the particular argument I've made in relation to Roag 2000 AD, I think the contextualist approach I've taken here is a more effective and a more respectful way of trying to understand poetic texts than simply assuming that their meaning is self-evident and proceeding on that basis. Before turning to the wider issue of cultural, ethnic, or territorial identity, I would also like to briefly take issue with the implication in On the Other Side of Sorrow that Catriona Montgomery is exclusively concerned with Gaelic culture and rejects others. Writing of his generation of Skye poets, and explicitly including Catriona Montgomery among them, Nus Macneachgal recently wrote, "We have all been open to the poetries of many cultures. each without losing sight of the sound qualities and rhythmic currents of our own. And he specifically mentions Montgomery's Gaelic translation of Pied Beauty by the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think the treatment of Caitriona Montgomery's verse in On the Other Side of Sorrow discloses a wider issue of identity in relation to the Gaeltacht. I think it discloses an attitude towards Gael as an identity that's implicit throughout the book and has a bearing on the kind of arguments that Hunter puts forward for the future of the Gaeltacht. In his critique of Roag 2000 AD, Hunter appears to associate himself with the identity Highlander when he says that any Highlander is likely to have some sympathy with the attitudes he found in Montgomery's poem. Indeed, this is consistent with how he situated himself earlier in the book as, and I'm quoting, a Highlander by birth, by residence, and by inclination. But in his critique of the poem, he appears at the same time to be dissociating himself from a Gael identity and the exclusionary, reactionary, and inadmissibly pessimistic attitudes that he has found, mistakenly in my view, in Roag 2000 AD, and which he associates with Caitriona Montgomery, and by extension other Gael. Directly following his condemnation of these attitudes, Hunter implores for a reworking of identity and for a new order for the Highlands and Islands, in which Gael, having just been subject to his critique, suddenly appear no longer part of, perhaps even excluded from, the area's future. He wrote, "Can we define the term Highlander in such a way that the issue of a person's ancestry becomes of much less importance than the fact that this person lives in, is committed to, this quite amazing tract of territory?" Following this statement, in the book's final pages, he unfolds a vision of the future in which Highlanders are repeatedly mentioned and Gael not at all. I read this and asked myself, what's going on here? Why does Hunter attach the nominal identity Gael to a reactionary, exclusionary past that he's invoked on the basis of a questionable interpretation of Montgomery's poem, while reserving the nominal identity Highlander, his own preferred identity, for a radical and supposedly inclusive future? Although Gaels exist in Hunter's Highland present, it's as a backward-looking reactionary element, and when it comes to consideration of the Highland future, they're erased, replaced by the Highlander. On rereading the book, I'm beginning to see that this form of identity privileging is in fact pervasive, but becomes more obvious when he's critiquing Caitriona Montgomery. After making his case for the new Highlander, Hunter, on the basis of visiting a Gaelic medium classroom in Lochaber in the mid-1990s, optimistically predicted that there were grounds for hope that Gaelic will not quickly become extinct. His view that Gaelic medium education can remedy the intergenerational loss of language in family and community demonstrates a lack of depth underpinning his vision. When On the Other Side of Sorrow was first published in 1995, such a hopeful view may have seemed justified in the first flush of the new Gaelic medium education. At the time of the second edition in 2014, it must have seemed somewhat naive to scholars working on these issues. Today, and following publication of Sailsh's Gaelic Crisis Report, it can no longer be considered serious commentary. In On the Other Side of Sorrow, Hunter approvingly quoted Edward Said to argue that, open quotes, uninteresting assertions of minor ethnic or group particularity, close quotes, would stand in the way of the kind of integration Hunter envisaged for different cultural or ethnic groups in the Gaeltacht. Given such views, it's entirely possible that Hunter would consider as undesirable, reactionary and exclusivist arguments for the survival of Gaelic as a living language of community, such as the proposal for Gael ethno-linguistic assembly put forward by the Sailsh scholars in the Crisis Report. Yet what is abundantly clear is that to the extent that Hunter's views on the integration of Gael and incomers have been put into effect, for Gael, such integration has been an abject failure, at least so far as language is concerned. Where two groups with particular or distinct ethno-linguistic characteristics exist in a shared social and political context, characterized by systematic forms of inequality towards the minority group, then integration on the terms envisaged by James Hunter appears to contribute to an ongoing process of erasing the characteristics of the minority group, assimilating them into the majority culture. This process of erasure may be viewed as minor or uninteresting by those who don't identify as part of the group whose characteristics are being erased. However, it's increasingly clear that such views do not represent a neutral, far less progressive ground. When we understand the past composed, as Hunter has noted in his own work, of competing discursive forces, it's clear that the history of Highlanders in Scotland is not the same thing as the history of Gael in Scotland. The history of Highlanders in Scotland in this sense can be understood as an account of how the term of identity Highlander and the ideas associated with it have emerged, developed, and contested ownership of the related material and discursive terrain and domain in which the Highlander has come to be. This history is very different from one which follows the same line from the perspective of Gael. This distinction was certainly a topic that was considered worth commenting on in the past. In the early 20th century, the scholar W.J. Watson said, "It was unfortunate that the great national term Gaelic had been so largely displaced in this country by the term Highland. Although most that was associated with the latter term was highly honourable, yet it was not free from its abuses in respect that it had obscured the fact that the name Gaelic is a national name." I'm grateful to Michael Newton for that quote and also for the other work that he's done on this issue. A few years earlier, the dictionary maker, Edmund Dwelly, had remarked pithily, "The term Gael is frequently erroneously translated Highlander, which is only a political Sassenach word invented to keep Gaels asunder and consequently comparatively helpless." If we identify with one term as against another, then we will produce a different understanding of ourselves and of our past. And it's perhaps in his acknowledgement of being a Highlander, as distinct from being a Gael, that Hunter may have disclosed why he has read Catriona Montgomery's poetry in the way that he has. The very term Highlander decultures Gael. It does not have a cultural denotation and merely identifies geographically those who live in a particular territory. As Dwelly remarked, it's not a term that sits easily in the lexicon of Gael, as it's a name invented elsewhere and tends to replace. The external invention of the Highlands as a term and as an ideology by outsiders has been well documented since Dwelly's comments, by the likes of Trevor Roper and more judiciously by Charles Withers. For outsiders, it has been primarily a means of categorizing us by way of instrumentalizing, romanticizing, or denigrating the ways in which we've lived and our beliefs about and attitudes towards the world. A fundamental aspect was, as Withers has argued, about transforming us in the service of others. So then, is it the case that to identify as a Highlander is to commit oneself to a subaltern heritage, to a view of oneself and of a territorially based society that's ultimately derived individually and culturally from without? I realise I'm pushing the point pretty hard here, and this is a serious and very challenging ontological question, but I constantly have in mind Catriona Montgomery's words, "Are we clinging by our nails to the rocks of time at this very moment?" which I think itself may refer to a line in Anculian. "The beauty of the great island rose before me. It rose, but the bullet whizzed. How long will this love keep its hold on the icy rock of the world?" The Saoilse Gaelic Crisis Report of last year has not only reiterated our linguistic vulnerability, but it's also helped with opening a space to consider what the philosopher Jonathan Lear, in the context of Indigenous groups in North America, has called ontological vulnerability. The idea that the reality in and by which a culturally cohering people are carried and carry themselves forward can be brought into doubt by cultural forces that come to dominate and, in Montgomery's words, to drown them, such that it becomes possible to envisage and indeed to experience the negation of that reality, a place of existential alienation that requires creative response. And in my reading of the work of Catriona Montgomery and of others of her generation, it's this they are bringing forth to our attention. And I think too of the untraced blood of the deer in Halig Wood and of the final lines of Uavanyar in Sorley Maclean's work. These are questions of the future ontological status, that is, of the future being and existence of Gael as Indigenous inhabitants of the Gàidhealtachd areas of Scotland. "The beauty of the great island rose before me. It rose, but the bullet whizzed. How long will this love keep its hold on the icy rock of the world?" Thank you.